All right, how you guys doing today? We're about to hop into part two of I Don't Believe the Dinosaur Extinction Story. First things first, I just want to make sure y'all like that video. Hit a like, exit full screen, scroll just a little bit, like the video, and then full screen it back up. You feel me? So if you remember from part one, I talked a lot about how sources aren't always listed. So I went to Riley's source material from the original article, the first one that we brought up, right? Around where they said most of these, which is representations of dinosaurs being made by ancient cultures, most of these things have been discredited, right? So I checked on this link of discredited, and it takes you to this very long list of objections to creationist ideas. I think I'm going to make a series of going down each one of these. This I actually like a lot because a lot of it has sources. So we can go and read these sources for ourselves and see what they actually say and don't just have to take things at our word, right? But the thing that struck out to me a lot about what this sentence was most of these have been discredited, right? So if you think that all of them have, you're wrong because it's most. Or most could just be a catcher when she really wanted to say all but had to give a little bit of grace there. But also what that long laundry list of websites had, it doesn't necessarily say where these things are. I think it would be in the paleontology section. It could be in the geology section. I don't really know. I'm going to be honest. But regardless of the fact, most of them has been discredited. We just checked that article out that said, oh yeah, we looked at it with our eyes and with some binoculars and with this big telescope, and we've seen that that drawing is in fact false. It's not true. They're superimposed, and it's not a dinosaur. Sure, sure. Anyway, so with the Deccan traps, I told you guys we're gonna get into the more biology, not my bad, the biblical arguments that I have for this, right? So the relationship between the Deccan traps and the Chicxulub crater, right? If you're unfamiliar with the Chicxulub crater. I'm looking at impactor while trying to say crater and wondering why it's anyway. But if you are familiar with the Chicxulub crater, it's the crater off the Yucatan Peninsula, right by the tip of Mexico, which is where the asteroid is supposedly thought to have hit the Earth and caused the extinction of the dinosaurs through a lot of different side effects that it had once it hit. So these things were essentially simultaneous within 50,000 years of the Deccan traps erupting was the hit of the asteroid, right? Some research indicates the main phase began 250,000 years before the impact. That's cool, right? But also, there's a connection because once the Chicxulub crater hit, the enormous energy released by the Chicxulub impact is thought to have triggered or significantly intensified the Deccan Traps volcanism. The impact could have generated seismic waves powerful enough to mobilize magma already present beneath the Deccan region, leading to a massive increase in eruption rates. So these things, they go off, boom. That causes some issues in some climates, whatever. Asteroid, boom, hits the Earth. That increases the Deccan traps this rates, maybe even some rates of other volcanic sites, right? But specifically the Deccan traps. And this is just Google, so I'm not really going to include this in my source list in the description. Maybe I'll just copy paste what I typed into Google. I don't know. We'll see later. So then going into the more biblical arguments that I have, we can see that in Genesis 7, which is around when this is where they talk about the flood story, right? So in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, 17th day of the month, in the same day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened, right? And so me looking at this, I'm thinking, I didn't know about the Deccan traps, right? And if you're unfamiliar with the creationist argument, it's that the Great Flood actually killed all the dinosaurs, like drowned them or something, because two of every kind of animal was brought onto the ark, not two of every animal, two animal after all of its kind. So it's like birds, insects, that type of junk. So when I see that the iguana looked like the iguanodon, I'm thinking maybe it really was just a big iguana and they took the little iguana because it could fit better on a boat. I don't know. You can check Answers in Genesis Canada, the YouTube channel for that. They have a great series on Noah's Ark. I will also link that in the description. But this is blueletterbible.com. This is where I use what I use to get a lot of in-depth old readings on the words in Hebrew or Greek when I'm searching in the New Testament. So anyway, reading this, I see what does it mean the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were open? Because a lot of people in their head, they think the great flood, they think, oh, it just started raining, and it rained for like what, 40 days? Yep, on earth 40 days and 40 nights, and it just rained, right? It says rain was upon the earth for 40 days. So when it says the fountains of the great deep broke up, what does that mean? And when you go to the use of the word fountains here, so we can see this, blah blah blah, or my bad, so of the deep, right? Fountains of the deep, this just means the depths of the deep places, the sea, all that. This could maybe be the tectonic plates, this could be deep below, subterranean levels, who knows? This is a very vast word. It doesn't necessarily say it's been used this many times. Deep, sea, abyss, almost always in poetry, not really here, but water making a noise, commotion, all this, blah blah blah, a great quantity of waters, the ocean and sea, right? So from the fountains of the deep, which could be a great quantity of waters, or it could just be a wave, right? Regardless, probably the ocean, probably the sea. This is the deep. The fountains, or my bad, breaks. We're looking at the word break. Mostly we can see to cleave, cleave open, break, break, cleft, rent, split open, broken into, cleave, cut to pieces, rend open, break, break, rip, torn. We get what a break is. You just did that little thing to it and now it's open. Fountains. This is where it gets interesting. The word fountain can be fountain. It can be translated as well, or it can be translated as spring. Outline of biblical usage mostly is spring. So when we see this, it says a fountain, calligraphy source, a fountain, a spring, or a well. If you've seen a spring, this is apparently what a spring looks like. Not this one, but more of all these kind of things. And if you can imagine this thing being ripped open, what would that look like? It probably started to look like you just turned a hose on and it just starts spraying out. I can't necessarily say. I don't really know what that looks like, but imagine the springs of the deep. So whatever emits water, but not these, right? Because this is just a spring. If it said the fountains, the springs have been ripped open, you could just take one of these and just bust it open, and then you got some water spraying mixed with the rainwater, and you're like, okay, that's not too crazy. But fountains of the deep, so springs of the deep. And all these things that these springs have in common, some of them are just bodies of water, some of them expel water. We don't really get that insight from down here, just as a place irrigated with fountains or the fountain itself, right? Regardless, fountains or a fountain, something that's emitting water. So more likely something like this, but of the deep. So somewhere deep in the ocean or a sea or waves, these things were torn open. So to me, that indicates some tectonic plates, because what's under the ocean, some people hypothesize that there's like magma or lava deep down under the ocean. So to me, who just found out about the Deccan traps and had to go back and look in Genesis to see, there are volcanoes, I thought it just rained. And maybe this was, because I'm thinking the flood caused the extinction of the dinosaurs, but according to Riley and the scientific community, the asteroid strike did it, right? I had to go look and see, maybe there's something about this. And lo and behold, something that I could attribute to this, right? I'm not saying it's definitive, but I'm saying that something about the fountains of the deep being ripped open could be, because it also said Earth strikes. Not only did a chunk of extraterrestrial rock strike the Earth, prior to that, a group of volcanoes did this, undergoing massive eruptions. Somewhere in here, or somewhere in another article, it mentioned earthquakes. Here we go. So according to the authors, the initial impact would have triggered massive earthquakes in the region, sent enormous tidal waves to shore. From a distance would have looked like a bomb going off, scalding air, material from the asteroid, fragments of Earth's crust as well. The matter exploded with so much force that some probably escaped into space. Some of this landed on material parts of the globe far from the center of impact, not hard enough to start forest fires. Bits and pieces could have heated things up in habitats all over the world. So there's also massive earthquakes, which could also be the fountains of the deep being ripped up, was just like earthquake ripping the ground open. If I didn't know what an earthquake was, that might be how I described an earthquake back then. It's like this thing in the ground of the deep was getting ripped open. Because if you've seen an earthquake, it's basically a giant crack in the ground, right? So that could be the biblical usage. I'll link that. So anyway, these tabs we can close. So if you know about the asteroid and you know about the giant amounts of iridium found across the Earth, marking the end of the Cretaceous period, it is known as the KT boundary. It is a big layer of iridium thought to have been caused by the asteroid hitting the Earth, because iridium isn't common on Earth, but it's common in asteroids. So the asteroid hits the Earth, big poof, smoke cloud goes up LeBron style, and then iridium rains down all over the Earth. To the iridium layer, if it's protected, or my bad, if it was preserved over time naturally, it would have created the KT boundary all across the world. We can look up a picture of that for you. So here you go. This is the layer of iridium caused by the asteroid, or supposedly caused by the asteroid. Initially, I brought up the English class in which I was writing about my creationist ideas, and in doing that research, I stumbled across not only an article, but also a peculiar verse in the Bible that I'd read before, but was unfamiliar with the meaning and just kind of read it as I went along, right? And honestly, I've never heard anybody else talk about this point. So what you're getting here is very new. At least to me, it's new. So in Psalm 104, David talks about the glory of God. You did all this stuff. You clothed with honor and majesty like a garment. Your angels are fires and spirits, and you laid the foundations of the earth that they shouldn't be moved forever, which goes against the idea of Pangea, because earth shouldn't move. You covered it with the deep, right? You laid the foundations of earth. Cool. You covered it with the deep. The fountains of the deep got ripped open. So if the fountains of the deep got ripped open, the water stood above the mountains. Okay, so we can see that he's talking about the flood here, right? At thy rebuke, they fled. The waters fled. The voice of your thunder hasted away at the end of the 40 days, right? They go up by the mountains, talking about the water. They go down by the valleys unto the place which you have founded for them. So the waters went up to the mountains. They went back down to the valleys in the place you established them to be. And verse 9 is where it gets interesting to me. You have set a bound, thou hast set a bound, that they may not pass over, that they turn not again to cover the earth. Some people may see this and say, oh, he gave them the rainbow after that. He shouldn't flood the earth again, right? You set a bound. They're not going to pass over this bound. They're not going to cover the earth again, right? And initially I was like, oh, shoot, that's the rainbow, right? He gave them the rainbow. The waters aren't going to go over the rainbow. They're not going to cover the earth again. But also, KT boundary. It doesn't say he set a bow that they may not pass over. He set a bound. And so in Genesis 9:13, right, he says, I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token, a covenant between me and the earth. And in English, we can see that there's a possession here, my bow. It doesn't necessarily stay in the Hebrew, but in the Hebrew, we can see it's mostly used as bow for hunting, bowmen, archers. Down here, the last use, rainbow, right? Only down here, we can see it used in Genesis 9:13 really, and Ezekiel 1:28. And in Ezekiel, he doesn't even talk about the rainbow necessarily, but just as the appearance of the bow, so was the appearance of brightness around, and it was the likeness of the glory of the Lord, right? Anyway, so we see here that it's like mostly just used to talk about this, whatever, like a bow, like a, bow and arrow type bow, which is the shape of a rainbow for sure. And that's that. However, in Psalms, and that word was cassette. In Psalms, we can see that the word is gabol, which is the boundary that he was talking about. You set a bound that the water should not pass over. Not you put your bow, his bow, right? Because it said my bow. I don't know if that's the same in Hebrew, right? But it didn't use the same word cassette. You didn't say you put your bow here. The word gabul is a border, a coast, a boundary, a landmark, space limit, quarters, or a non-translated variant. Border, territory, region, territory, all this type of jazz. This also could be a different language, so to speak. I don't really know. Okay, so according to BibleWorld.net, most of it, both Genesis and Psalms, are written in Hebrew. The complexity range from Aramaic possibly to natural evolution of languages. So if David wanted to use cassette, he would have used cassette. This isn't like if you're familiar with the story of Daniel and they talk about the rib and the rib in Genesis. This is not the same there. Daniel was way after. David was decently close to this. Anyway, we can see border and all that type of jazz. And if we go look for it in Psalms, actually in here also, we can see that it's used in Jeremiah 5:22. I didn't even know that. Fear ye not, will you not tremble in my presence, which is placed the sand by the bound of the sea, as a perpetual decree that it cannot pass, though the waves thereof toss themselves, cannot prevail. Maybe it's talking about the sand, but we see that the waves do toss themselves, and tsunamis and all that do happen. So for me, I don't really, which have placed the sand for the bound of the sea by a perpetual decree. It seems like it's pretty straightforward there. I'm not gonna lie. Maybe it's talking about the sand. Regardless, I think that it's also a way to talk about the KT boundary, because if that really killed dinosaurs, right? The iridium falling and everything. Maybe the Lord put that as a barrier, saying, this is where I ended and will not send the waters above again to kill everything, because that killed the dinosaurs in the creationist worldview. I'm not saying that my view is right or anything. I'm just saying that this is the evidence that I have in the Bible to justify why there's a KT boundary, how the dinosaurs went extinct, and all that different type of jazz. So for me, that kind of works. And Jeremiah 5:22 thing, I'll have to read that in context and get back to you. Because see, to me, this doesn't really hit the same, because I can't imagine that the sand that he didn't mention putting the sand in a decree, right? A perpetual decree that the waters can't pass over the sands, but we see that happening all the time. What we don't see is the flood of the world happening again, which is evidenced by the rainbow one, but also could be the KT boundary saying the water should not pass up too far again, right? Water goes over sand all the time. Okay, so David Guzik, I'm not sure which, in his commentary says that Jeremiah used the illustrations of ocean and sand, the waters of the sea continually pounding against the sand, yet the sand remains. The sea remains within its bounds. The analogy is clear. If the ocean cannot prevail against the sand, God's people will never prevail against in their rebellion against him. God has chosen to arrest the advance of mighty billows by a barrier of sand grains. There are many illustrations in the history of the church. The pride and the persecutor have been arrested by prayers and the tears of men, women, and children, who have had no more strength in themselves than a bank of sand of grains, but have succeeded in arresting the mights of their foes. So this, according to somebody who's definitely well more versed than me, was an illustration used by Jeremiah, but I thought he was giving a prophecy here straight from the Lord. Maybe not the case. I still think my bound theory is correct to describe the iridium layer, as it doesn't naturally appear on Earth, and that the dinosaurs would have been killed by the flood. Not that. Y'all can let me know what y'all think about it down in the comments. Alright, that's going to be the end of the video. Hope you guys have yourself a fantastic rest of your day. Peace.